The moment you disappear, something unexpected happens in her mind. Not anger, not relief, confusion. A quiet, unsettling confusion that she doesn't talk about but feels deeply. Because when you were present, even if things weren't perfect, there was a pattern. There was predictability. She knew how to read your tone, how to anticipate your reactions, how to feel secure in the rhythm of your attention. And then suddenly that rhythm stops. No explanation, no warning, just absence. And the human mind hates unfinished stories. At first, she tells herself it's nothing, that you're busy, that you'll show up later like you always do. But minutes stretch into hours and hours stretch into silence. And that's when her thoughts start looping. She replays the last interaction again and again, searching for something she missed, a word she said wrong, a tone you used differently, a moment that could explain why you vanished. Because when someone disappears without chaos, the mind assumes meaning. What makes this moment powerful is that her usual emotional control stops working. She's used to knowing where she stands, used to having access, used to being able to influence the situation with a message, a reaction, or a response. But now there's nothing to react to, no signal to interpret, no emotional feedback. And that lack of feedback creates psychological tension. Your silence doesn't give her answers, it creates questions. And questions are far more consuming than clarity. She checks her phone without realizing it, not because she's desperate, but because her mind expects something to be there. A notification, a sign, anything. And every time there's nothing, the confusion deepens. Not panic yet, just discomfort. Because your absence has interrupted her sense of control. She can't tell if you're pulling away, testing distance, or simply choosing yourself. And that uncertainty keeps her mind engaged. What's important to understand is that confusion is not indifference. Confusion is engagement without resolution. Her emotions haven't chosen a direction yet, which means they're still open, still sensitive, still processing. And while she may not admit it, part of her is unsettled by how easily you step back. Not dramatically, not emotionally, just quietly. That quietness sends a message without saying a word. She starts comparing this silence to past situations. People who disappeared emotionally but stayed physically. People who talked but didn't mean it. And your absence feels different. It doesn't feel needy. It doesn't feel reactive. It feels intentional. And intentional silence triggers reflection. It makes her wonder if you're seeing something she isn't, if you've reached a decision she hasn't caught up to yet. This is where the shift begins, because on day one, she hasn't lost you, but she has lost certainty, and certainty is comfort. When certainty disappears, the mind tries to restore it. That's why she keeps thinking. That's why she keeps replaying. Not because she's weak, but because the connection is unresolved. You didn't disappear to punish. You didn't vanish to manipulate. You simply removed your presence. And in doing so, you created space. Space for her to feel what your presence was actually doing in her life. Space for confusion to replace control. Space for the story to pause. And that pause is where everything starts to change. By the second day, the confusion hasn't disappeared, it has shifted. It hardens into something quieter but more complex. This is the moment her ego steps in and tries to take control of the situation. Not because she's suddenly over you, but because the mind needs protection when emotions start feeling exposed. So she tells herself a story, a calm one, a confident one. I don't care. If he wanted to talk, he would. I'm fine. And for a brief moment, she almost believes it. But the ego and the heart rarely agree. The ego wants dignity. The heart wants certainty. And when those two collide, tension forms. She might say she's unbothered, but her mind keeps drifting back to you at the most random moments. While doing something ordinary, while scrolling, while sitting in silence. And she doesn't like that. Because thinking about someone who isn't thinking about you feels like losing. So she resists. She avoids checking your profile, then checks it anyway. She tells herself she won't reach out, then types a message and deletes it. Not because she wants to chase, but because part of her wants to regain emotional balance. The ego frames it as self-respect, but beneath that is uncertainty. She doesn't know where she stands anymore, and that unsettles her sense of power. This is the day she starts measuring value, not out loud, Internally, she asks herself why your absence is affecting her more than she expected. Why silence from someone who doesn't matter is occupying mental space. And that question bothers her because it challenges the image she has of herself: strong, independent, unmoved. Your disappearance quietly threatens that image. At the same time, she becomes more aware of your emotional restraint. You didn't argue. You didn't explain. You didn't try to pull her back emotionally. And that lack of reaction feels unfamiliar because most people react when they're losing something. Most people seek reassurance, but you didn't, and that absence of emotional noise forces her ego to work harder to justify the situation. She might start comparing how other people respond to distance, how easy it is to get attention elsewhere, how messages arrive quickly when she wants them. And yet, none of that feels the same. Because what's missing isn't attention, it's your attention. And the ego hates admitting that distinction. It would rather say, anyone can replace this, than admit, this specific presence mattered. So the internal battle intensifies. One voice says, let it go. Don't care. The other asks, why does this feel unfinished? And the more she tries to silence that second voice, the louder it becomes. Because unresolved emotions don't disappear, they wait. This is also when pride becomes a mask. She might act normal, even confident, even distant. But inside, she's watching. Not obsessively yet, just observantly, looking for signs, patterns, anything that confirms whether your silence means detachment or depth. And the longer you remain absent, the harder it is for her ego to maintain the illusion of indifference. Day 2 isn't about missing you openly. It's about resisting the realization that your absence has emotional impact. It's about her ego trying to stay in control while her feelings quietly slip past it. And that internal conflict doesn't push her away, it pulls her inward. Because when ego and emotion fight, attention follows the emotion. And the silence continues. By the third day, something deeper settles in. The initial confusion has faded into the background, and the ego's resistance has grown tired. What remains now is weight. A subtle, emotional heaviness that wasn't there before. This is the moment when absence stops feeling temporary and starts feeling real. Not dramatic, not painful yet, just present. And presence, even in silence, has power. She starts noticing the spaces you used to occupy. Not just in conversations, but in routines. Moments where she would normally expect your message. Thoughts she would normally share without thinking. Emotional checkpoints throughout the day that quietly included you. And now those moments feel empty. Not loud, just hollow. And that's when your absence becomes tangible. This is where her mind begins to adjust its expectations, and that adjustment is uncomfortable. Because expectations create emotional stability. When someone becomes part of your inner rhythm, their absence disrupts more than habit. It disrupts emotional safety. She may not label it that way, but she feels it. A sense that something familiar is no longer available, and she didn't prepare for that shift. She tells herself this is normal. That people come and go. That silence doesn't mean loss. But her emotions aren't convinced yet. They keep returning to the same realization: your presence added something. Something subtle but steady. And now, without it, things feel slightly off, not enough to panic, enough to notice. Her mind begins revisiting memories, not out of nostalgia, but out of comparison. How she felt when you were around versus how she feels now. And that contrast sharpens the emotional weight. She realizes that what she's missing isn't constant communication, but emotional grounding. The feeling of being understood without effort. The comfort of knowing someone was there in a consistent way. This is also when rationalization starts losing strength. The stories she told herself on day 2 don't fully hold anymore. The ego can say, I'm fine, but the body and emotions tell a quieter truth. Her energy feels different. Her attention drifts more easily. And she doesn't like not knowing why. What makes day 3 powerful is that she no longer sees your absence as a tactic or a phase. She starts considering the possibility that this could be permanent. And permanence changes everything. Because when the mind entertains loss, even briefly, it activates emotion at a deeper level. She may not be afraid yet, but she's aware. She wonders if you're feeling the same gap, if you've noticed the silence, if it affects you at all. and that question lingers. Because if you don't feel it, that means she misjudged the connection. And if you do feel it but chose silence anyway, that means your restraint is stronger than she assumed. Either way, the uncertainty adds weight. This is when she stops waiting for a message and starts feeling the absence instead. Waiting is active, feeling is internal, and internal experiences are harder to escape. She might distract herself, stay busy, fill the day with noise, but the quiet moments still bring the same awareness back. Something has shifted. Day 3 isn't about longing, it's about recognition. Recognition that your absence has become part of her emotional landscape, that what she thought was replaceable now feels specific, and specificity creates attachment. Because when something feels unique, it becomes harder to dismiss. You didn't say anything, you didn't explain, you didn't ask for reassurance, and that quiet consistency allows the weight to settle naturally. No pressure, no force, just space. And in that space, your absence begins to mean something. By the 4th day, the emotional weight doesn't disappear, it transforms. What was once a quiet sense of absence now turns into curiosity, and curiosity has a way of pulling the mind deeper than emotion ever could. This is the day when her thoughts stop circling around what happened and start reaching toward what it means. And meaning is where attachment grows. Her mind begins filling in the blanks your silence left behind. Because silence doesn't remove stories, it invites them. She wonders where you are, what your days look like now, who you're talking to. Not out of jealousy yet, but out of imagination. And imagination is powerful. It creates realities without evidence. Every unanswered question becomes a canvas, and her mind paints it with possibilities. She might casually check things she told herself she wouldn't. Not obsessively, not desperately, just enough to feel connected to the unknown. A glance, a pause, a moment of searching for signs. Because when answers are missing, the brain looks for patterns, and when patterns aren't clear, it creates its own. What makes this stage dangerous in a quiet way is that curiosity doesn't feel emotional. It feels logical. It feels harmless. She tells herself she's just wondering, just thinking, just observing. But curiosity is the doorway to obsession because it keeps attention alive without resistance. There's no ego fighting it now, no confusion pushing back, just focus. She starts replaying subtle details. Things you said that felt insignificant at the time. Changes in your tone before you disappeared. Small behaviors she overlooked. And now those fragments gain importance. Her mind connects dots that may or may not exist, but the act of connecting deepens emotional investment. Because the more time the mind spends on something, the more value it assigns to it. This is also when comparison intensifies. She measures your silence against others' presence, the messages that arrive easily, the conversations that feel light but empty, and she notices the difference. Attention without depth doesn't satisfy curiosity, it amplifies it. Because what she's seeking isn't noise, it's understanding. And your absence has become the puzzle her mind wants to solve. There's also a subtle shift in how she views you. On earlier days, she focused on how your silence affected her. Now she starts thinking about you, your mindset, your reasons, your emotional state. And when someone's thoughts shift from self to another, emotional attachment strengthens. Because empathy bridges distance. She wonders if your silence is strength or indifference, if you're protecting yourself or pulling away for good, and the uncertainty creates tension. Not anxiety yet, just mental engagement, the kind that keeps resurfacing when everything else quiets down. Because unresolved curiosity doesn't rest, it waits. Day 4 is when silence becomes a trigger. Not painful, not alarming, stimulating. It activates imagination, speculation, and emotional focus, and focus, repeated over time, becomes fixation. She might not realize it, but she's now emotionally investing energy into the absence itself. And absence, when given meaning, becomes presence. What's important is that you haven't fed this curiosity with words. You haven't clarified, you haven't reassured, you haven't denied. And that restraint keeps the mystery alive. Mystery isn't created by games, it's created by consistency without explanation. And consistency without explanation makes the mind work overtime. She may tell herself that if you wanted to be there, you would. But the thought doesn't settle the curiosity, it deepens it. Because if you could reach out and chose not to, then that choice must mean something. And meaning is irresistible to the mind. By day 4, she's no longer just feeling your absence. She's thinking about it. By the 5th day, something fundamental shifts inside her. Curiosity no longer feels neutral. The stories her mind has been creating begin to carry emotional consequences. This is when fear quietly enters the picture, not panic, not desperation, but a subtle awareness that something valuable might be slipping away. And fear of loss has a way of cutting through pride, logic, and self-control. She starts asking a different kind of question now. Not why did he disappear, but what if he doesn't come back? That single thought changes the emotional direction completely. Because as long as silence feels temporary, it's manageable. But when the possibility of permanence appears, the mind reacts differently. Loss activates urgency. This fear doesn't show up as weakness. It shows up as awareness. Awareness that your absence has lasted longer than expected. Awareness that you haven't broken. Awareness that whatever is happening on your side isn't driven by impulse. And that realization unsettles her because it means the situation may be out of her control. Her ego tries one last time to regain balance. It reminds her of her options, of her independence, of how easily attention can be found elsewhere. But now those thoughts feel forced, because fear of loss isn't about options, it's about attachment. And attachment doesn't respond to substitutes. It responds to meaning. She begins to emotionally revisit moments she took for granted. Times when your presence felt steady, predictable, safe. And now, those memories feel more valuable than they did before. Not because they were perfect, but because they were consistent. And consistency is often only appreciated once it's gone. This is also when she imagines outcomes. You moving forward. You choosing distance permanently. You no longer being emotionally available. And even if she pushes those images away, they leave an imprint. Because the mind rehearses loss before it accepts it. And rehearsing loss makes it feel real. The fear isn't loud. It doesn't demand action immediately. It sits quietly in the background, influencing her emotional responses. She may feel more sensitive, more reflective, less certain. And that uncertainty draws her inward. She's no longer trying to win. She's trying to understand what she might lose. What's powerful about this stage is that logic no longer leads the conversation. Fear overrides rational explanation. She can't explain away the feeling that your absence matters. She can't convince herself that it doesn't affect her. Because the emotional weight has reached a threshold. She wonders if you've emotionally detached already, if you've processed something she hasn't. And that thought creates imbalance. Because if you've already let go while she's still processing, then she's behind. And being behind emotionally triggers urgency. This is where silence gains its strongest influence. Not because it demands attention, but because it withholds reassurance. Reassurance would calm fear. But your absence allows fear to do its work naturally. No manipulation, no pressure. Just consequence. Day 5 is when she feels the pull. The internal pressure to resolve the uncertainty, to reduce the fear, to restore emotional equilibrium. Whether she acts on it or not, the desire is there. The emotional gravity has shifted. She's no longer focused on pride. She's focused on loss. By the 6th day, the internal tension reaches a point where something has to give. Fear has done its work. Curiosity has exhausted itself. The emotional weight is settled. And now, what remains is the need for resolution. Not drama, not confession, just clarity. Because the human mind can tolerate pain longer than it can tolerate uncertainty. She feels the pull to break the silence. Even if she doesn't act on it immediately, the impulse is there. It shows up in quiet moments, in half-written messages, in thoughts that begin with maybe I should, not because she suddenly lost control, but because emotional pressure seeks release. Silence created the question. Now her emotions want the answer. What's important is that this urge isn't driven by desperation, it's driven by imbalance. Your absence has shifted the emotional scale. She's been processing, wondering, imagining, fearing, while you've remained quiet. And that contrast matters. Because when one person stays grounded while the other carries emotional movement, power shifts naturally. She may try to delay it. Convince herself she doesn't need closure. Tell herself that if you wanted to talk, you would. But those thoughts no longer calm her, because by now the silence feels too intentional to ignore. It doesn't feel like avoidance. It feels like choice. And when someone chooses silence, the mind assumes purpose. She starts imagining what would happen if she reached out. Not the message itself, but the outcome. Would you respond calmly? Would you stay distant? Would you reveal something she hasn't considered yet? And that anticipation becomes another form of emotional engagement. Because reaching out now isn't about getting attention, it's about restoring balance. This is where her perception of you changes most clearly. You're no longer just someone who disappeared. You're someone who didn't react. Someone who didn't chase clarity. Someone who allowed space to exist without filling it. And that restraint registers as emotional strength. Whether she admits it or not, she may feel resistance from her ego one last time. A reminder of pride, of not wanting to be the first to speak. But fear of loss has already softened that resistance, and when fear and curiosity align, ego loses its grip. Because ego protects image, emotion protects connection. Even if she doesn't send the message, the desire itself is significant. Because it means your absence has reached her core. It has shifted her from processing internally to considering action. And that shift only happens when emotional value is present. What you did was simple but rare. You didn't disappear to provoke. You didn't vanish to control. You chose restraint. You chose self-respect. You allowed silence to speak without forcing it to. And in doing so, you let her emotions unfold naturally, day by day. By now, she doesn't just feel your absence. She feels your presence in it. And whatever happens next, the dynamic has already changed.